The document sat on the table between them like a loaded gun, and Theodora Collins felt the full weight of what she had done. Or rather, what she had refused to do settle over her like a cold Wyoming winter. Abraham Sutton's jaw was tight, his dark eyes burning with something that wasn't quite fury and wasn't quite hurt, but lived somewhere in the dangerous country between the two. He stood on the other side of that rough-hewn kitchen table, 6 feet of broad-shouldered rancher with sun-darkened hands, and a heart she had spent the last 3 weeks trying very hard not to think about. The unsigned deed sat between them, the blank line at the bottom as damning as any confession. "You came here to take my land," he said, and his voice was so quiet it was almost worse than shouting. "That was the whole point of you. Caldwell sent you to finish me off." Theodora didn't look away. She had learned a long time ago that looking away was the same as admitting guilt, and this, whatever this was not what she felt guilty about. What she felt guilty about was the opposite. She felt guilty about staying. She felt guilty about the way she had started watching for the lantern light in his barn at night. Guilty about the conversations that stretched past supper into the long blue hours of evening. Guilty about the way she had begun, without meaning to want him to win. "The document isn't signed," she said. "I can see that. Then you know what I'm telling you." He moved around the table, and Theodora held her ground even when every instinct in her body told her to step back, because stepping back felt like surrender, and she had surrendered enough ground already, not the acreage kind, but the kind you gave up inside yourself when someone started to matter. He stopped an arm's length away, and up close, the expression on his face was worse. It wasn't anger. It was something closer to devastation. Theodora, her name in his mouth sounded like a prayer and an accusation at the same time. What did you just throw away for this? She thought about the answer. She thought about the $300 waiting in Caldwell's safe in Laramie. She thought about the job she would lose, the protection she would forfeit, the very particular and dangerous kind of enemy a man like Randolph Caldwell made when he felt crossed. She thought about all of it, and then she looked at Abraham Sutton's face, and she said the only honest thing she had left. Something that was never worth keeping. The story of how they arrived at that kitchen table, at that unsigned document, at that moment of reckoning between two people who had no right to feel about each other the way they did, began 4 weeks earlier in the city of Laramie, Wyoming, in the year 1883. Theodora Collins was 27 years old and had been supporting herself since she was 19, which was the year her father's debts had come due, and the farm in eastern Nebraska had been swallowed by a bank that had never once looked at what the land meant to the family that worked it. She had gone to Laramie with $30 and a letter of introduction to a land broker named Harmon Welch, who had taken one look at her sharp eyes and precise handwriting and hired her as his clerk. She was good at the work. She understood property boundaries and survey maps. She understood the language of deeds and titles and the small, critical details that determined whether a transfer of land was clean or compromised. She had an eye for hidden encumbrances, old liens, contested boundaries, quiet claims that could surface years later and unravel a sale completely. Harmon Welch called her his secret weapon, which was flattering until she understood that he meant it quite literally. Randolph Caldwell came to the office on a Tuesday in late September, wearing a coat that cost more than Theodora earned in 2 months, and carrying a pocket watch that caught the light every time he consulted it, which was often. He was a man who understood the language of demonstrated wealth and used it the way other men used their fists. He was 44 years old, thick through the middle, with pale eyes that had the particular quality of seeming to calculate rather than simply see. He did not address Theodora directly for the first 15 minutes of his conversation with Harmon Welch. He spoke about the Sutton property the way a man might discuss a piece of furniture he intended to acquire, as though the question of the current owner's wishes was a minor technical detail rather than a human reality. "The Sutton parcel," he said, spreading a survey map across Welch's desk, sits directly between my eastern and western holdings. With it, I control the full water access from the northern branch of the Laramie River all the way south to the junction. Without it, I am working around an obstacle." He paused and tapped the map with one thick finger. "I do not enjoy working around obstacles." "Abraham Sutton is not selling," Welch said. He said it carefully, the way a man says a thing he believes to be true but wishes were otherwise, because the person he's saying it to is a man whose wishes he has learned to treat as potential commands. Caldwell's pale eyes moved to Theodora for the first time. He looked at her the way she imagined a dry goods merchant looked at an item on the shelf he was considering purchasing, not unkindly, but entirely without recognition of her as a person with an independent existence. "Your girl understands deeds," he said to Welch. "Miss Collins is my senior clerk," Welch said, with a small emphasis on the title that Theodora appreciated. "She handles all our complex transfers. Then she can handle this one." Caldwell picked up the pocket watch, looked at it, tucked it away. "Sutton has been alone out there since his wife passed 2 years ago. He's behind on his county tax assessment, not fatally, but enough to make him aware that the future is uncertain. He's proud. He won't listen to an offer from me directly because we have history." He said the word history the way other people said the word inconvenience. "But a woman coming out there as a land agent, representing buyers who want to relocate their family operation, a sympathetic story, a fair-seeming offer, a woman with a face like that one." He gestured toward Theodora in a way that made her feel briefly like she might like to throw the survey map at him. "He'll talk to her. He'll let her in, and then she can assess the property, identify any outstanding issues with the title, and present him with a purchase agreement." Welch cleared his throat. "And the purchase price?" "Fair market value," Caldwell said. "I'm not asking anyone to cheat the man. I simply need someone he will speak with who can make the case for selling." He paused. "The case being that if he does not sell to me voluntarily within the next 60 days, I intend to purchase his tax debt from the county and foreclose." The room was quiet. Theodora watched the survey map. She watched the lines that defined the Sutton property, a generous rectangle of land with the river cutting through the northern corner, just enough water access to be the difference between a viable cattle operation and a slow decline. She thought about what it meant to own land like that. She thought about what it meant to lose it. "You want me to deceive him," she said. Caldwell looked at her as though she had said something mildly interesting. "I want you to represent a transaction. What you choose to share about the ultimate buyer is a matter of professional discretion." "That is a very clean way of describing deception," Theodora said. Welch made a small sound of alarm. Caldwell, to her surprise, smiled. It was not a warm smile, but it was a genuine one, as though he had not expected resistance and found it briefly entertaining. $300 above your annual salary," he said, "for 60 days of work and one completed transaction." Theodora thought about the $30 she had arrived in Laramie with. She thought about the single room she rented above the dry goods store and the cold that came through the walls in winter. She thought about what $300 represented, the kind of security that changed the shape of a future, the kind that let a woman think about something other than whether she would be all right. She thought about all of that, and she said yes. She told herself it was business. She told herself that Abraham Sutton would be compensated fairly, that she would review the title thoroughly and ensure there were no hidden problems with the purchase agreement, that she would conduct herself professionally and honestly in every respect except the single detail of who was ultimately behind the offer. She told herself a great many things on the 3-day journey from Laramie to the Sutton Ranch, in the hired buggy with the survey maps rolled in the case on the seat beside her. She arrived at the Sutton property on a Friday afternoon in early October, and the first thing she saw was a man on horseback crossing the near pasture with the kind of ease that suggested he and the horse had been having a conversation for years and had long since resolved any disagreements. He rode without theatrical flourish, the way competent people do things, thoroughly, quietly, without needing to be watched. The second thing she saw was the land itself, and she understood immediately why Caldwell wanted it. The pasture grasses were autumn gold and deep, the kind of ground that held water well and gave it back slowly all summer. The fence lines were straight and well maintained. The barn was old but solid, with a new roof section visible on the eastern side where someone had replaced damaged shingles with careful precision. The house was modest, a frame structure with a wide porch, painted a faded white that had probably been sharp and proud a decade ago, and had since settled into something more lived in, more honest. The man on horseback saw her buggy and changed direction. He came toward her at an unhurried trot, and when he was close enough, he stopped and removed his hat in a gesture that was entirely natural and entirely without performance. Abraham Sutton was 32 years old, lean in the way that men who work land are lean, all function. No excess, with dark hair that needed cutting and the kind of eyes that took in a great deal before deciding how much to give back. He was not conventionally handsome in the way the dime novels described Western men, with their square jaws and their lightning-fast draws. He was something more ordinary and more compelling than that. He was a man who looked exactly like what he was, and Theodora, who spent a great deal of her professional life detecting the gap between what things appeared to be and what they actually were, found that unexpectedly disarming. "Sutton Ranch," he said. "You're a ways from the road." "I am looking for Abraham Sutton," she said. "I'm Theodora Collins. I represent a land and property firm out of Laramie." Something in his expression shifted, not closed exactly, but more careful. He put his hat back on. "Is that so? I have a proposition I've been asked to present. You are under no obligation to hear it, of course. But I understand you've been managing this operation alone since—" She stopped, because she had been about to say since your wife died, and that was information that felt invasive to use as a point of entry. "For some time," she finished. He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of assessment that was not unfriendly but was thorough. Then he said, "You'll want water and somewhere to rest the horse after 3 days from Laramie. Come in." That first evening, Theodora sat at the kitchen table where 3 weeks later she would place an unsigned deed and tell Abraham Sutton the truth about everything. That first evening, the table held a plate of beans and salt pork that he had made without apology or ceremony, a cup of coffee that was stronger than any she had tasted, and a conversation that began as professional and turned, by degrees she did not track carefully enough, into something else entirely. He asked questions about land law the way a man who cares about something asks questions, not to fill silence, but because he actually wanted to know. He had a dispute with the county over a survey marker that he believed had been moved, and he wanted to understand his legal standing. Theodora, who knew the relevant statutes, explained them with the precision she brought to everything, and watched his attention sharpen in a way that she recognized as intelligence engaging with information it found genuinely useful. She did not present the purchase agreement that first evening. She told herself it was because he needed time to trust her. She did not examine too closely whether trust was a professional tool or something she wanted for its own sake. She had come prepared to stay 3 days. She stayed 3 weeks. The professional rationalization was easy enough to construct. She needed to review the title history thoroughly before presenting a clean offer, and the county records in Laramie did not have the complete filing history for the original homestead claim. The records she needed were in the property box Abraham kept in the desk drawer in the room he called the office, which was really just a corner of the parlor with a roll-top desk, and shelves stacked with account books and survey records and correspondence. He gave her access without hesitation. That, more than anything, was what began to dismantle the comfortable professional distance she had been maintaining. He trusted her with his records the way you trust someone you have reason to trust, and she had given him no reason that wasn't false. The title history was, in fact, complicated. The original homestead had been filed by Abraham's father, Jonas Sutton, in 1869 under the provisions of the Homestead Act. Jonas had died in 1877, and the property had passed to Abraham, who had married Clara Hendricks in 1879. Clara had died in the autumn of 1881 from a fever, and the property had remained in Abraham's name alone. Simple enough on its face. What was not simple was a secondary filing Theodora found in the county records she had brought with her. A competing claim filed in 1871 by a man named Terence Galt, asserting that the original survey had improperly excluded 40 acres of the northern pasture that Galt claimed had been verbally promised to his family before Jonas Sutton filed. The claim had been administratively dismissed in 1872, but it had never been fully adjudicated, and Galt's estate had changed hands twice since then. The current holder of the Galt estate interests, Theodora discovered after careful cross-referencing in the survey maps, was Randolph Caldwell. She sat with this discovery for a long time on a Tuesday evening in the second week of her stay, while Abraham was in the barn, and the lamplight made long gold shapes across the papers spread on his desk. The meaning of what she was looking at assembled itself with the slow, terrible clarity of something you had half known and refused to see. Caldwell did not merely want to buy the Sutton property. He already possessed, or believed he possessed, a dormant legal claim to the northern 40 acres, the section that contained most of the water access from the river. If he purchased the deed to the full property through a voluntary sale, the Galt claim would become irrelevant, absorbed into his ownership. But if Abraham refused to sell and Caldwell moved to foreclose on the tax debt, Abraham could potentially defend the property long enough to make foreclosure procedurally difficult. The Galt claim, however, if resurrected in that context, could be used to tie up the northern pasture in litigation for years, effectively strangling the ranch's viability without requiring a direct legal victory. Abraham would face the choice of fighting on two fronts simultaneously, tax debt and competing title claim, with the resources of a single man against those of Randolph Caldwell. The purchase offer Theodora had been sent to present was not simply a business proposition. It was a trap, a generous-seeming door that once declined would be followed by two closing walls. She sat with this for 3 days. She did not present the purchase agreement. She told herself she was still gathering information, still ensuring she had the full picture before drawing conclusions. But in those 3 days, she had dinner twice with Abraham, helped him inventory the account books for the fall cattle assessment, walked the fence line of the northern pasture with him on a clear Wednesday morning, and listened to him talk about the land with a specificity of feeling that no one talks about something with unless it is the center around which the rest of their life is organized. He had been born in the house they were living in. His father had broken the ground before the nearest town was more than a trading post. His mother had planted the kitchen garden, the remnants of which still showed along the south wall of the house in the stubborn persistence of the herb border. She had put in sage and thyme, and something woody and gray-green that Abraham called by a name she did not recognize. He had proposed to Clara in the north pasture, by the river, on an evening in May. He had buried her under the cottonwood at the east edge of the property, in ground he owned and knew and would be able to find in the dark if he had to. On the 3rd day after she found the Galt claim documents, Theodora Collins sat down and wrote a letter to Randolph Caldwell in Laramie. It was a professional letter, carefully worded. It informed him that the title review had revealed a complexity that required additional investigation, and that she would require more time before the offer could be properly presented. It was not a lie. It was a delay, and she knew it, and she also knew that delay was not the same as refusal, and that refusal was what the thing she was feeling actually required. She mailed the letter and went back to the work of knowing, with increasing precision, exactly how much she did not want to do what she had been sent here to do. The evenings were the hardest part. Not hard in the way that difficult professional situations were hard in the way that being in the presence of a person whose company you have come to value is hard when you know you are there under false pretenses. Abraham Sutton did not perform anything. He was not charming in a calculated way, did not produce the kind of practiced ease that city men sometimes offered to women they wanted to impress. He was simply present, in the way that people who live close to the land and far from manufactured social obligations sometimes are direct, unhurried, genuinely curious about her, in a way that felt like being taken seriously rather than being managed. He asked her, on a Thursday evening in the third week, how she had come to do this kind of work. The question was asked with the same directness he brought to everything, and she found she did not want to give him the version she usually gave, the professional narrative of skills and opportunities. She told him about Nebraska, about the farm, about the bank. He listened without the kind of performative sympathy that makes you feel your grief is being assessed for appropriateness. When she finished, he said, "That is why you understand what land means. Not a question. An observation delivered with the quiet accuracy of someone who had been paying attention." "I understood it before," she said. "Losing it made me understand it differently." "How so?" She thought about it. "Before I understood it as something you had. After I understood it as something you are." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the lamp. Then he said, "My father used to say that the difference between a homesteader and a speculator was that the homesteader knew his name was in the ground, that the soil knew it too." He paused. "I thought that was romantic nonsense when I was young. And now I think he was being precise." That was the moment, if she was honest with herself, and she was working very hard at honesty, that she stopped lying to herself about what was happening. Not that anything was said or done. Nothing was. But something shifted in the quality of the air between them, the way air shifts before a storm changes the weather from one thing to another, and Theodora Collins, who was very good at reading the weather of situations, knew exactly what she was reading. She did not present the purchase agreement. She kept filing requests for additional title research. She wrote a second letter to Caldwell explaining that the Galt claim complication required careful handling before any offer was made, and that she was pursuing the matter thoroughly. This was true. She was pursuing it very thoroughly indeed, pursuing it in the direction of finding Abraham a legal defense. She spent 4 days at the county courthouse in the nearest town, a place called Millard's Crossing, 12 miles east of the Sutton property. She reviewed the original dismissal of the Galt claim and found what she had hoped to find. The administrative dismissal in 1872 had been based on the absence of any written documentation supporting the verbal promise Terence Galt had asserted, and the dismissal had included language indicating that without such documentation, the claim had no standing. 40 years of administrative precedent since then had consistently held that verbal land agreements predating homestead filings were unenforceable against a properly filed claim, and the Sutton homestead filing was entirely proper. The Galt claim was not a legal weapon. It was a shadow alarming enough to intimidate, but without the substance to actually endanger a properly defended title. What Caldwell was counting on was that Abraham, faced with the combination of tax debt pressure and the threat of a competing claim, would not have the resources or the legal knowledge to distinguish between a real threat and a paper one. Theodora Collins, sitting in the Millard's Crossing courthouse with the dismissal document in her hands, understood with complete clarity what she was going to do. She was going to go back to the Sutton ranch and tell Abraham everything, about Caldwell, about the trap, about the Galt claim's weakness, about the purchase agreement in her document case that she had never intended to show him once she understood what it actually represented. She was going to do this knowing that it would end her employment with Welch's firm, forfeit the $300, and make her an enemy of Randolph Caldwell, who was a man with the kind of resources that made enemies uncomfortable for a long time. She drove the 12 miles back to the Sutton ranch in the rented buggy, with a clarity that felt like the opposite of peace, not calm, but resolved, the way you feel when you have stopped fighting a decision and simply made it. He was at the kitchen table when she came in, working through the account books for the quarterly cattle assessment. He looked up with the particular expression that she had noticed over the past weeks, a specific quality of attention that he reserved for her arrival, a subtle brightening that he did not seem aware of performing and that she had spent considerable energy trying not to interpret. "You found something," he said, not a question. She set her document case on the table and sat down across from him and said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you decide what to think of me." The account books were forgotten. He sat back in his chair, crossed his arms, and waited. That was one of the things about Abraham Sutton. He was very good at waiting. He did not fill silence with reassurances or defenses. He simply gave her the space to say the thing. She told him everything. She told him about Caldwell. She told him about the purchase agreement in the case. She told him about Caldwell's plan to use the tax debt and the Galt claim as leverage if Abraham refused to sell. She told him about the $300 and what it had meant to her, and what she had decided about it. She laid the documents on the table as she spoke, the Galt claim dismissal, the survey maps, the purchase agreement with its blank signature line, and she watched his face and told him the truth. When she finished, the kitchen was entirely quiet. The lamp burned steadily. Outside, the wind had picked up in the darkness, the way Wyoming wind does in October, with a directness that makes no apology. Abraham looked at the documents for a long time. Then he looked at her. "You came here to take my land," he said, and his voice was so quiet it was almost worse than shouting. "Yes," she said, "that was the whole point of me. Caldwell sent you because he thought you'd get through my defenses." "Yes, and the document isn't signed." "No. Why?" The question was simple and enormous, the way the real questions always are. Theodora looked at him across the table, at the documents between them, at the unsigned purchase agreement that represented the end of her professional position and the beginning of something she did not yet have a name for. "Because this land is where your name is in the ground," she said, "and because Caldwell doesn't deserve it and you do. And because I stopped being able to do what I was sent to do somewhere around the second week, when I realized I would rather be on your side of this than his." Something moved across his face, the devastation she had seen earlier, shifting into something more complicated, less readable. He was quiet for a long moment. "What do you lose," he said, "telling me this?" "My position. The $300. Probably Welch will have to let me go because Caldwell will pressure him to." She paused. "Possibly a great deal of inconvenience from a man who has the resources to make refusing him expensive." "And you knew all this before you drove back from Millard's Crossing?" "Yes." "Then why?" "I told you why," she said. And then, because she had committed to honesty and partial truths were not honesty, "I told you the professional reasons. The other reason is that I have spent 3 weeks in your company, and I would like very much to be a person you can trust, and I cannot be that person while I am keeping this from you. That is the whole truth." The silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before, not the comfortable quiet of two people at ease together, but the charged stillness of something in the process of becoming. Abraham Sutton stood up from the table and walked to the window that looked out on the dark pasture. He stood there for a while with his back to her. Then he said without turning, "What do we do about Caldwell?" "We." The word arrived with the quiet force of an axle pin engaging a small thing that locked something larger into place. "You need to address the tax debt," she said. "If you eliminate that pressure point, the Galt claim is meaningless on its own, and I can provide you with the documentation to rebuff it if he tries to resurrect it. The tax assessment is $412. When does it become a foreclosure risk?" 90 days from the notice I received in August," he said. "So approximately 60 days from now. Have you the funds?" He turned from the window. His expression had settled into something that was not quite calm but was resolved, the same quality she recognized from her own face in the courthouse mirror that afternoon. I have 280 in savings. I would need to sell cattle ahead of schedule to cover the rest. He paused, which puts me in a disadvantaged position in the market. Theodora opened her document case and took out the bank envelope that had been sitting in there since she left Laramie. Caldwell's advance payment, $150 against the $300 promised on completion. She placed it on the table. This covers the difference. He looked at the envelope. He looked at her. That is your money. It was Caldwell's money given to me to betray you. I prefer it spent in the direction of doing the opposite. Theodora, her name in his mouth, again that particular quality of simultaneous tenderness and seriousness that she had been cataloging without meaning to for weeks. I cannot take your money. You can pay it back, she said, when the cattle sell in the spring. It is a loan if that makes the architecture of the thing more acceptable to you. She paused. Though I will point out that you are a man standing in the kitchen of your own ranch with 60 days to solve a problem, and I am a woman who is about to be unemployed, and the time for pride from either of us is possibly not this precise moment. Something shifted in his face. The terrible seriousness cracked briefly into something that was almost a smile, the first real one she had seen from him in 3 weeks, not the polite variations he offered when things were simply pleasant, but the full version which did something to his face she was not prepared for. I appreciate directness, he said. I know, she said. I've noticed. They sat back down at the table and worked through it together. The plan for addressing the tax debt, the legal documentation needed to rebuff the Galt claim, the letter she would need to write to Welch formally withdrawing from the Caldwell engagement. They worked for 3 hours, with the lamp burning and the wind picking up outside and the account books and survey maps spread between them, and at no point did either of them acknowledge what was also happening in the space between the professional documents. The thing that had been building for 3 weeks and was now simply present, no longer deniable, waiting with the patience of something that knew it had time. At 11 o'clock, when the plan was as complete as it could be made that night, Abraham made a fresh pot of coffee and poured 2 cups without asking if she wanted one, because in 3 weeks he had learned she always wanted one, and this small evidence of having been paid attention to made Theodora's throat do something inconvenient. "Where will you go," he said, "after you send the letter to Welch?" She had not thought about this with any precision. The $300 was gone. Her position was gone. She had enough savings for 2 months in Laramie, perhaps 3 if she was careful, while she looked for new employment. The options for a woman with her skills in 1883 Wyoming were not extensive, but they were not nothing. "Laramie first," she said. "I need to deliver the Caldwell documents personally, give him the Galt claim research, the dismissal record, the full title analysis. He may be angry, but he is a businessman. Knowing the Galt claim is unenforceable may actually lead him to make a clean, transparent offer to you directly, without the trap element." Abraham turned his coffee cup in his hands. "You do that. Go back to Laramie and face him." "I'm not afraid of Randolph Caldwell," she said, which was not entirely true but was true in the way that mattered. She was not afraid in the way that would stop her. "I think," Abraham said, choosing his words with the care he brought to things that mattered, "that you are one of the most capable people I have ever encountered." He paused. "And I think that if you go back to Laramie and I do not find a way to ask you to come back, I will consider it one of the great failures of my judgment." The kitchen was very quiet. The lamp threw its warm light across the table between them. Theodora looked at him and found that honesty, once fully committed to, had a momentum that was difficult to stop. "Then ask me," she said. He looked at her with those dark, assessing eyes that had been paying attention since the first afternoon. He set down his coffee cup. "Come back," he said, "after Laramie. Come back and help me hold this land and see whether you want to stay." "That is a very practical proposal," she said. "I am a practical man." A pause. "But I mean it entirely." She thought about the single room above the dry goods store in Laramie. She thought about the cold through the walls in winter. She thought about the sage and thyme along the south wall of this house, and the river in the north pasture that she had walked beside on a clear Wednesday morning, while Abraham had named the grasses in a voice that held the knowledge of a person who had learned them the way you learn things that are part of you. She thought about 3 weeks of evenings that had felt, despite everything that was wrong about the circumstances, more like home than anywhere she had been since Nebraska. "I mean it entirely, too," she said. The next morning, Theodora Collins drove to Millard's Crossing and posted 2 letters, one to Harmon Welch formally withdrawing from the Caldwell engagement, one to Randolph Caldwell himself, containing a complete professional summary of the title research she had conducted, including the full legal analysis of the Galt claim's weakness, and a clear statement that the claim would not survive any judicial review. She worded the Caldwell letter with surgical precision, making it clear that she was providing this analysis in her professional capacity, that the information was accurate, and that she recommended he approach the Sutton property, if he wished to pursue it at all, through a transparent and direct offer at fair market value, and that any attempt to use the tax debt as a foreclosure mechanism would be resisted with full legal documentation of the Galt claim's invalidity. She drove back to the Sutton ranch and told Abraham what she had sent. He stood on the porch and listened, and when she finished, he said, "You handed him the weapon you could have used to negotiate a better position for yourself." "I handed him the truth," she said, "which is not a weapon, it is just what is accurate." He nodded slowly. "And now I need to go to Laramie and close things out with Welch, and then I will come back if the offer still stands." "It stands," he said. And then, with a directness that matched hers and always had, "It will stand as long as it needs to." The trip to Laramie took 3 days. Harmon Welch was apologetic in a way that was genuinely sad. He was a decent man caught between a difficult employer and a principle he had not quite had the courage to prioritize. He gave her 2 weeks' wages and a letter of professional reference that was so generous it made her feel worse about leaving than she had expected. Caldwell she did not see directly. His secretary received the documentation package she had prepared, and she left without waiting for a response. She settled her affairs in 2 days, packed what she owned into 2 traveling bags and a document case, arranged for the rest to be shipped to Millard's Crossing when she had a permanent address, and boarded the stage back south. The Sutton Ranch on a clear November morning looked exactly like itself. The autumn gold pastures had gone to their winter bronze, the frost making the grass sharp and detailed in the low morning light. Abraham was at the fence near the barn when she arrived, and he came toward the buggy without hurrying but without hesitation, and he took her bags before she had fully climbed down, and neither of them made the moment more theatrical than it was, because it did not need to be. "Welcome back," he said. "Thank you for the offer," she said. He smiled, the full version, the one she had been keeping a careful internal record of since the first time she saw it. "Come in," he said. "I made coffee." The weeks that followed were a different kind of life than anything Theodora had known. She knew how to work, had known since she was 19, but this work had a different quality. It was not work performed in service of someone else's enterprise. It was work aimed at a place she was beginning to believe was hers to aim at, the way you aim yourself at things you have decided to belong to. She took over the accounts completely and found in them 2 years of deferred maintenance decisions and small financial inefficiencies that could be corrected without large expenditure. She wrote to 3 cattle buyers in Cheyenne and established a correspondence that resulted in a standing pre-sale agreement that would allow Abraham to move his cattle at a predictable price in the spring, without the disadvantaged market timing the tax debt pressure had threatened to force on him. She organized the outstanding legal documentation for the survey dispute with the county, a different matter from the Galt claim, a genuine error in an 1878 resurveying that had moved a marker 8 feet east of its correct position, and drafted a formal objection with supporting evidence that she believed would prevail. And in the evenings, after the work was done and the lamps were lit, and the Wyoming wind moved outside the windows the way it always did, With its particular kind of relentless honesty, she and Abraham Sutton talked. They talked about everything about land law and cattle markets, and the nature of property rights, and the question of what the West was becoming now that the open range era was ending, and fences were going up across the grasslands. They talked about his father and her father, and what it meant to inherit a thing, whether what you inherited was land or debt or the shape of your own character. They talked about Clara on one evening when the subject arrived naturally, with a gentleness that Theodora tried to match. Clara, who had been warm and capable and deeply loved, and was gone, and could not be argued with or replaced, only remembered, and Abraham's grief for her was a fact of the landscape like the cottonwood over her grave, present and real and not requiring management. "I am not trying to set her aside," he said on that evening. "I want you to know that. I am not looking for a replacement. I would not want to be," Theodora said. "I am a rather specific person." "Yes," he said, "you are a pause. That is what I mean." The first time he reached across the kitchen table and took her hand, it was not a dramatic moment. It was the end of a long evening's work on the spring cattle assessment, and they were both tired and the lamp was burning low, and he simply covered her hand with his and looked at her with everything he was feeling entirely visible in his face, and she turned her hand over and held his back, and that was that. The thing that had been becoming became. Caldwell's response to her letter arrived in December, 3 weeks after she had returned to the ranch. It was not warm, but it was professional. He acknowledged the legal analysis of the Galt claim, stated that he had reviewed it with his own counsel and concurred with her assessment. He withdrew the Galt claim from any active consideration. He also made, as she had suggested he might, a direct and transparent offer to purchase the Sutton property, a figure somewhat above fair market value that he acknowledged was his attempt to make the case for a voluntary sale more compelling than it had previously been. Abraham read the letter twice and handed it to Theodora. She read it and said nothing, waiting. "No," he said. "I expected that answer," she said. "I want to write him back," Abraham said, and there was a quality in his voice that she recognized as the precise and controlled variety of anger a principled man feels about a thing he has decided not to act on recklessly. "I want to write him back and tell him exactly what I think of a man who would use a dead woman's estate claim as a litigation threat against a man who did him no injury." "You can write that letter," Theodora said, "but I recommend you not send it." "Why?" "Because the best reply to Randolph Caldwell is a profitable spring cattle sale, and a solved survey dispute, and a ranch that is demonstrably thriving. A letter he can show his associates as evidence of your emotional investment in the conflict is worth less than the silence of a man who is simply not available to be destabilized." He looked at her. "You are very good at this." "I know," she said. "It is why Welch hired me." He drafted a letter that was 2 sentences long, a formal declination of the offer, and a statement that the property was not available for purchase and would not be at any foreseeable point, and she approved it, and he sent it, and that was the last they heard from Randolph Caldwell for 6 months. December moved into January, and January was the kind of Wyoming January that is less a month and more a sustained argument with the world about whether warmth is a reasonable expectation. The cattle were in the winter pasture. The creek in the north section was frozen to a depth that required daily checking, and the days were short and the evenings were long, and the house was warm with the kind of warmth that is not just temperature but the quality of shared space, of 2 people who have decided to occupy the same set of walls without reservation. He asked her, on a Sunday evening in January with the snow coming down outside and the kitchen warm with the smell of the bread she had learned to make in the oven he had repaired in November, whether she would consider making the arrangement permanent. He did not say it in an elaborate way. He was not an elaborate man. He said, "I have been thinking about the spring, about the summer. I keep thinking about them as things we will do together, and I would like that to be something more than an assumption." Theodora put down the bread knife. The snow made the windows look like frosted glass, soft and diffuse. The lamp was steady. "Are you asking me to marry you, Abraham?" "I am," he said, and his voice was steady and entirely certain, the voice of a man who has made a decision after genuine consideration and is not second-guessing it. "Then yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He crossed the kitchen and kissed her with the same quality he brought to everything important, thoroughly, without rush, as though he had arrived at a place he intended to stay. They were married in March of 1884, at the Millards Crossing Church, with the minister who had also married his parents and buried his father and, more recently, buried Clara, a man who understood something about the continuity of things. The witness at their wedding was a neighboring rancher named George Pratt and his wife Helen, who had become Theodora's first real friend in the territory, a direct, sensible woman who had built her own life in Wyoming from components that had not been designed for ease, and who recognized a kindred construction in Theodora immediately. The spring cattle sale exceeded projections. The pre-sale agreement Theodora had negotiated with the Cheyenne buyers held, and the price per head was 12% above what Abraham had averaged over the previous 3 years. The tax debt was cleared in April, with enough remaining to begin the barn expansion Abraham had been deferring for 2 years, and to repair the east fence line that had been patched rather than replaced for too long. The county survey dispute was resolved in June in Abraham's favor, with the survey marker restored to its correct position, and a formal acknowledgment of the error entered into the county record. The kind of victory that was quiet and administrative and mattered enormously because it settled a thing that had been unsettled, which was exactly the kind of victory Theodora preferred. Caldwell made one more approach in July, through an intermediary who came to the ranch while Abraham was in the north pasture, and Theodora was in the office reviewing the summer account books. The intermediary was a young lawyer from Cheyenne, polite and well-dressed, and visibly uncomfortable with the nature of his errand, who offered a figure for the property that was now substantially above fair market value. Caldwell, having lost the legal threat angle, had apparently decided to simply outbid the market. Theodora received the lawyer in the parlor and offered him coffee, which he declined, and listened to the offer with the professional attentiveness she brought to all such things. When he finished, she said, "The property is not for sale. It has not been for sale at any point during which Mr. Caldwell has expressed an interest in it, and this has been clearly communicated on 2 previous occasions. Please convey to your client my appreciation for what is admittedly a generous figure, and my firm conviction that no figure will change the answer." The lawyer left. Abraham came in from the north pasture an hour later, read the business card the lawyer had left, and looked at her with an expression that was equal parts gratitude and something warmer. "He'll try again," Theodora said. "Probably," Abraham said. "He will eventually stop." "Why?" "Because men like Caldwell have many projects and we are becoming an expensive and unrewarding one. He will find another obstacle to remove, and we will become the one that got away, which will irritate him briefly and then recede." She paused. "Unless you do something to give him a reason to make this personal." "I have no intention of doing that," Abraham said. "I know," she said. "That is one of the things I counted on." By the summer of 1884, the ranch was operating at a level of stability it had not known since, before Clara's illness had drawn down the reserves, and before the tax pressure had begun to constrict Abraham's decision-making. The account books showed a property in clear positive territory, with the cattle herd healthy and the pastures well managed, and the infrastructure steadily improving. Theodora had become, in the territory, a person of some professional reputation that was separate from her role as Abraham Sutton's wife, though the 2 identities were not in competition, because she had never been inclined to see her abilities as something that needed to be subsumed by marriage. She helped 2 neighboring homesteaders with title disputes that had been simmering unaddressed for years, work she did at no charge because the homesteaders could not afford professional fees, and because the work was right. One of those cases involved a widow whose late husband's homestead claim had a procedural deficiency that a speculative buyer had discovered and was attempting to exploit a situation with enough similarity to her own history that she felt its resolution personally as well as professionally. She won both disputes. The word spread in the way word spreads in small territorial communities, not loudly but thoroughly, and she found herself approached by a steady trickle of people with property questions that required more than county clerk assistance. She began to formalize this work in the autumn of 1884, establishing what she called a land title and legal correspondence service from the ranch office, charging fees on a sliding scale that allowed her to serve those who needed it and still generate income that contributed meaningfully to the ranch's financial picture. Helen Pratt called her the most dangerous woman in the county, in the fond and entirely complimentary way that this was meant, and Theodora accepted the description without modifying it. In the late autumn of 1884, she told Abraham over breakfast that she was expecting. He put down his coffee cup and looked at her with an expression that she had not seen on his face before, a kind of stunned tenderness that was different from his usual quality of attention, softer and more unguarded. As though the news had bypassed the careful reserve he maintained around the things that mattered most to him and landed directly somewhere essential. He came around the table and held her with a thoroughness that expressed everything he was not quite ready to put into words, and she let him, because some things were better communicated than spoken. The winter of 1884 to 1885 was hard, as Wyoming winters reliably were, but it was the particular kind of hard that is made bearable by warmth of the non-atmospheric variety, the warmth of a house where two people have decided to be fully present to each other, where the evenings are long and purposeful, where there are plans being made and futures being drawn in the account books and survey maps that covered the desk in the corner of the parlor. Theodora continued her land title work through the winter, conducting most of it by correspondence, her reputation by now well enough established that she received inquiries from as far as Cheyenne. She was careful with the work, more careful than she had ever been with Welch's firm, because the people she was working for now were people whose situations she understood with a specificity that was no longer merely professional. She had been the person on the wrong side of a land transaction, the person without resources or recourse. She did not forget that. Abraham watched her work with an attention that was not supervision, but something more like witnessing, the particular awareness of a person who is paying attention to someone they love performing at their fullest capacity, and finding the sight of it not threatening but deeply right. In February of 1885, there was a moment that Theodora would remember for the rest of her life for its quietness. She was at the desk in the parlor office, working through a title search for a family in Goshen County, and Abraham came in from the evening barn check, bringing the cold with him in his coat and the particular outdoor smell of winter and hay and horses that she had learned was simply the smell of this life, this place, this person. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her, and she looked up and he said nothing, just looked at her with that full attention expression he had, the one that held everything he was and everything he felt, and she looked back at him in the lamplight and thought, this is the shape of it. This is what it looks like when you are exactly where you should be. She did not say this out loud. She said, come see this boundary description. I think there is an error in the 1876 survey, and I want a second opinion. He came and looked over her shoulder and gave his opinion, which was accurate, because he knew survey maps the way he knew his own land, by feel as much as by logic. And then he put his hand on her shoulder, and she put her hand over his, and they stayed like that for a while, looking at the survey map in the lamplight. And it was an entirely ordinary moment and completely irreplaceable. Their son was born in June of 1885, On a warm morning with the pasture grass green from the spring rains and the cottonwood over Clara's grave in full summer leaf. Abraham was present throughout, steady in the way he was steady about everything that mattered, and afterward he sat beside her with their son dark-haired, loud, magnificently certain of his own importance in a way that newborns are, and he said, "Jonah's," and she looked at him and said, "For your father." "If you agree." "Jonah's Abraham Sutton," she said, trying it. It settled like something that had always been waiting to be said. "Yes." Jonah's Abraham Sutton arrived in the world with the energy of someone who intended to have opinions about everything, which Theodora felt was a promising attribute. He was healthy and loud and entirely absorbing in the way of infants, and the ranch accommodated his presence with the flexibility of a place that had been through enough to know that life expanding was always better than life contracting. Helen Pratt came over 3 times in the first week and brought food and sensible advice, and sat in the kitchen saying things that were both funny and true, which was her highest skill. George Pratt added a section to his congratulatory comment to Abraham by saying that the county needed another sharp-eyed person with Theodora's instincts working property law, and that the baby had arrived in a good time and a good place. And Abraham agreed with the particular quality of agreement that comes from a man who knows he is fortunate and is not taking it for granted. Caldwell, as Theodora had predicted, made no further approaches to the Sutton Ranch after the July 1884 rejection. By the following year, they heard through the Millards' crossing rumor network, which was efficient if not always precisely accurate, that he had purchased a large parcel south of Cheyenne and was occupied with the development of that property, which was considerably larger and more strategically placed than the Sutton land had ever been. The Sutton Ranch had, as Theodora had forecast, become the one that got away, a minor irritation in the rear view of a man with many other places to direct his attention. She felt no satisfaction about this that was connected to Caldwell. She felt enormous satisfaction about it as it pertained to the ranch itself, the clean reality of a place that was no longer under threat, that was simply itself, doing its own work. The survey dispute victory was commemorated, in Abraham's quiet way, by the planting of a fence post at the restored marker position, a new post, straight and well set, that marked not just a property boundary but the resolution of a thing that had needed resolving. Theodora walked out with him on the day he set it, with Jonah strapped to her back in the carrier that Helen had taught her to make, and they stood at the boundary marker in the autumn light, the grass going gold around them, and she felt the weight of everything that the past year had been and turned into, all the layers of it, the betrayal she had been sent to commit and refused, the hidden motive she had uncovered, the trap she had dismantled, the dark past of her own loss that had made her capable of understanding what this land was worth defending, and underneath all of it, running through it like the river through the north pasture, the thing that had changed everything, a man at a fence line on a Friday afternoon in October, who had said come in with a simplicity that turned out to be everything. "You are thinking very loudly," Abraham said beside her. "I am thinking about sequence," she said, "about how things that look like disasters from inside them sometimes turn out to be the most direct route to the place you needed to be." He looked at her the way he had been looking at her since the beginning, with the full, unhurried attention of a man who has found the thing he was looking for and intends to be worthy of it. "Nebraska," he said, "and Caldwell," she said, "and Welch and the $300 and the document I did not sign." "Everything that got you to that kitchen table," he said. "Yes." He reached over and took her hand, the way he had the first time, at the kitchen table with the lamp burning low, the simple gesture that had been the beginning of the permanent. She held his hand back in the afternoon light, with Jonah's asleep against her back and the new fence post standing straight and true at the properly surveyed boundary of land that was not for sale and never would be, and the Laramie River running somewhere north of them in the cold October light, indifferent to property lines and devoted to no one, The way rivers are, just moving, just present, just doing what rivers do. The spring of 1886 brought the presale agreement with the Cheyenne buyers to its third year, and Theodora renegotiated it with a new provision that gave the Suttons more flexibility on timing and a price floor that insulated them from the market volatility that had been affecting cattle operations throughout Wyoming. The negotiation was conducted by letter over 6 weeks, with Abraham providing the operational knowledge and Theodora providing the contractual architecture, a collaboration that had by now become so natural that neither of them tracked where one person's contribution ended and the other's began. She also, in the spring of 1886, took on a formal partnership with a Cheyenne lawyer named Edmund Briggs, who had been receiving copies of her title work through referrals, and had written to say that her analytical work was of a quality he had rarely encountered, and that he would like to discuss a formal arrangement. The arrangement they arrived at was practical and well-structured. She provided title research and legal document preparation for his property law cases in exchange for a share of fees and access to his law library, which was the resource she had been working without, and which made everything she did considerably more efficient. Briggs was 60 years old and had been practicing law in Wyoming since before statehood was a serious proposition, and he had the particular respect for competence over credential that sometimes characterized men who had built their own expertise from raw material rather than institutional transmission. He referred to Theodora in his correspondence as my associate, Miss Collins, which was technically incorrect since she was Mrs. Sutton, and she corrected it once and then let it go, because it seemed to cause him genuine confusion, and the substance of the arrangement was more important than the title. In the summer of 1886, a letter arrived from Laramie, not from Caldwell, who had been entirely silent, but from Harmon Welch. He was retiring, he wrote. He was 63 and his health was not cooperating, and he had decided that the time had come. He had been approached by 2 buyers for his firm, but before he concluded any sale, he had wanted to write to Theodora because the honest assessment of his career was that the best work his firm had ever done had been done during the years she worked for him, and he had been sorry to lose her in the way he had, and he wanted her to know that, and also that she was, in his professional opinion, as capable a land title analyst as he had encountered in 40 years of practice. She read the letter at the kitchen table, which was where she read all correspondence, because it was the center of the house and had always been the place where things arrived and were decided. She wrote back to Welch a warm letter that acknowledged the professional debt she genuinely owed him. He had given her the foundation she had built everything else on, and wished him a healthy and peaceful retirement. She did not mention Caldwell. Some things were better left in the past they had come from. Abraham read her letter before she sent it. He was thoughtful about letters, careful, and she had found over 2 years of marriage that his judgment on what to include and what to omit was consistently good. He said the letter was right, which was the highest thing he said about things, and she sent it. That autumn, Jonas turned 1 and demonstrated with enthusiasm his developing views on mobility by achieving a creditable crawl that allowed him to pursue the barn cat with a determination that the cat found objectionable. Abraham watched this with an expression of genuine delight that Theodora catalogued with the same careful appreciation she brought to all the versions of his face, this one being the version she had not known existed until Jonas arrived and which was, she privately thought, the best one. By the end of 1886, the Sutton Ranch was a different operation than the one Theodora had arrived at on a Friday afternoon in October of 1883. Not larger, they had added one adjacent parcel that came available when the homesteader to the east had decided to return to Missouri, purchased at fair price with 2 years of careful savings. Not dramatically more prosperous because the cattle market had its own rhythms and Wyoming whether its own opinions, but deeper, more secure, more fully itself. The fences were right, the title was clean, the accounts were sound, the legal standing of the property was documented and defended. The thing that Caldwell had intended to destabilize had been stabilized not by fighting him directly, but by making the property so unassailably itself that there was nothing to destabilize. Theodora Collins Sutton, sitting in the parlor office on a December evening in 1886, with Jonas asleep down the hall and Abraham reading by the fire and the Wyoming wind doing its steady work outside the windows, looked at the survey map of the Sutton Ranch pinned to the wall above the desk. The full property, including the new eastern parcel, all of it properly surveyed, all of it documented. All of it held and felt the particular satisfaction of a person who has built something that will last, not just the ranch, not just the legal foundation she had constructed around it, the thing itself, the life. She thought about the woman who had arrived at this property 3 years ago with a document case and a hidden purpose and $300 of betrayal money and the accumulated weight of every loss she had ever absorbed. And she thought about what that woman had expected and what she had received instead, and she understood that the unexpected nature of the gift was not incidental to its value, that the trap had led to freedom, that the hidden motive had been replaced by an honest one, that the forced choice had turned out to be the easiest choice she had ever made, which was to put the unsigned document on the table and tell the truth and let whatever came from that be the thing her life was made of. Abraham looked up from his book. The fire gave the room its amber quality, warm and steady. He looked at her the way he always did, fully, unhurriedly, as though seeing her was something worth doing properly. "Come sit down," he said. "You've been working for 4 hours. The Briggs file needs to be finished before the county filing deadline." "What's the deadline?" "Friday." "It's Monday." "I like to have margins," she said. "I know," he said. "Come sit down anyway." She came and sat beside him, and he put his arm around her and she fit into the space beside him, the way things fit into the spaces that were made for them. And the fire was steady, and the wind moved outside, and Jonas slept down the hall with his dark hair and his definite opinions about barn cats and the world. "The eastern fence needs another post on the south run," Abraham said. "I saw that this afternoon," she said. "I'll get to it tomorrow if the weather holds." "The weather will not hold," she said. "There is a front moving in from the north. I could see it in the way the horses were moving this afternoon." He looked down at her with the smile she had been keeping a record of, the full version, and said, "How do you know that from the horses?" "You told me," she said. "In November of 1883. You said the horses move differently when there is weather in the north. They turn their quarters to it while there is still sunshine." She paused. "I pay attention." "Yes," he said. "You do." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "So do I." The world outside the windows was dark and cold, and the wind was working. The world inside the windows was warm and lit, and entirely theirs. Theodora Collins Sutton put her head on her husband's shoulder and listened to the fire and thought about nothing in particular and everything in general. The way you think when you are not managing a situation but simply living inside one, which was the difference between the life she had been living when she arrived and the life she had now. And the distance between those two things was the whole story. In the spring of 1887, she told Abraham at breakfast that Jonas was going to be a brother. He looked at her, put down his coffee, did the same thing he had done before, came around the table and held her with a thoroughness that was its own complete language. "When?" he said. "October, I think." "October," he said. He sounded the word the way people sound months that mean something particular to them. She knew what October meant to him, the month his wife had died, the month that had carved a grief-shaped space in his life that had been there when she arrived and was still there, because grief doesn't disappear, but it does, over time and in the presence of enough love, find its proportion. It does not go away. It becomes part of the house, one of the rooms, not the only one. She said, "Good things happen in October too." He pulled back and looked at her face. "Yes," he said, "they do." The second child arrived in mid-October of 1887, on a morning when the frost was on the pasture and the cottonwood was in its full autumn gold. A daughter, this time dark-haired and fierce in her early announcements of existence, emphatic in a way that made George Pratt, when he heard the story, say that the county was not ready for another Sutton woman, which was the highest compliment available in the idiom of the Laramie River Valley. They named her Clara Eleanor Sutton Clara for the woman who had been loved before and was still loved, and whose memory lived in the house and the land and the cottonwood that carried her name against the eastern sky. Eleanor for Theodora's mother, who had planted kitchen gardens and raised a daughter who understood what things were worth. Abraham held Clara Eleanor on the first evening with an expression that held more than Theodora had words for grief and gratitude and continuity all present at once, the way only a person who has genuinely loved and genuinely lost and genuinely found again can carry multiple large feelings in the same moment without any of them canceling the others out. "It's all right," Theodora said quietly because she understood. "I know," he said. "It is." He looked up at her. "It is more than all right." Jonas, at 2.5, investigated his sister with the scientific thoroughness of a person who had opinions about all new arrivals and was reserving judgment. By the second day, he had apparently rendered a verdict, because he brought her the barn cat, who was already resigned to Jonas's attentions, and placed it carefully next to her with the gravity of someone bestowing a great gift. The cat, for once, did not object. The Sutton Ranch in the autumn of 1887 was a place with children in it, and the smell of Clara Eleanor's first weeks and Jonah's moving through the house with the particular energy of a toddler who has been recently promoted from only child and is still calibrating what this means. The office in the corner of the parlor had acquired a small chair beside the main desk, low enough for a child to sit in, sized for a Jonas who would sometimes come and sit very seriously beside Theodora while she worked, producing crayon constructions on whatever paper she could spare and presenting them as documents requiring her professional review. The work continued. Edmund Briggs retired in 1888 and left her his case files and an introduction to his successor, a younger lawyer named Carolyn Webb, one of the very few female lawyers practicing in Wyoming Territory, which was preparing in 1889 to become a state that would be notable for being the first in the nation to grant women the vote, a fact that Theodora found both overdue and gratifying. Carolyn Webb was 31 and precise, and had the same quality Theodora had, the quality of a person who had built their expertise through necessity and knew it down to the ground. They became professional colleagues and then friends, and the correspondence between the Sutton Ranch in the Laramie River Valley and Carolyn Webb's practice in Cheyenne became one of the formative professional relationships of both their careers. The spring cattle sale of 1888 was the best in the ranch's history. The pre-sale agreement had been renegotiated twice, with improving terms each time, and the eastern parcel had turned out to have exceptional summer grazing that allowed the herd to be expanded more efficiently than the original property alone would have permitted. The account books for the year closed with a figure that made both of them look at it for a moment in quiet appreciation before Abraham said, with characteristic understatement, "That's better." "Significantly better," Theodora said. "The fence post on the south run of the eastern parcel needs replacing," he said. "I know," she said. "I'll add it to the capital expenditure line." He looked at her. She looked at him. They were sitting at the kitchen table, with the account books open between them, and the lamp burning and Jonas, asleep down the hall, and Clara Eleanor making the small navigating the world sound she made in her sleep. And outside the windows the Wyoming night was doing exactly what it always did, and the kitchen was warm, and the man across the table was the man whose name was in the ground alongside hers now. Both of them staked to this place with the full weight of everything they had chosen and refused and survived and built. "Theodora," he said. "Yes. What do you think about the south pasture for cattle next season? The grass there ran long this autumn." She thought about it. She looked at the survey map on the wall. She said, Move the herd there in April once the freeze is fully out of the ground and rotate back to the north in June before the summer dry sets in. The south pasture can carry more than we've been running if we time the rotation right." He nodded. Then, "And what do you think about us?" She looked at him, at the question that wasn't about cattle. "I think we are doing exactly what we should be doing," she said, "in the place we should be doing it, with the people we were supposed to be doing it with." "That is a very thorough answer. It is a very complete situation," she said. He reached across the table. She turned her hand over. They held on, the way they had been holding on since the beginning, not desperately, not dramatically, but with the sustained and certain grip of two people who have examined the alternative and found it entirely unacceptable. Outside, the night moved on. Inside, the lamp was steady. The Sutton Ranch held its ground, as it had always held its ground, not because the world had agreed to be kind to it, but because the people inside it had decided in that kitchen at that table, over an unsigned document and a full telling of the truth, that this was the place worth keeping. And they had been right. The document that Theodora Collins had never signed remained in her correspondence file, in the bottom drawer of the parlor desk, not as a reminder of the betrayal she had almost committed, but as a reminder of the moment she had stopped. She looked at it sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, and the work was done and Abraham was reading by the fire, and she thought about the woman who had arrived with it in her document case, certain that professional necessity and financial pressure were sufficient reasons to deliver a good man's land into the hands of someone who had no right to it. She thought about that woman with sympathy and without contempt, because that woman had been doing what she knew how to do with the resources she had, and the only difference between that woman and the one she had become was a single act of honesty at a kitchen table in October, at the absolute highest cost she had been willing to pay, which had turned out to be no cost at all but the beginning of everything. She closed the drawer. She went and sat beside her husband. The fire was warm and steady, the way good things are when they have found their shape and settled into it, and outside the Wyoming night was doing what it always did, and inside this house that had been built by a man who believed his name was in the ground, two names were now in it together, deep as the cottonwood roots and as permanent as anything that lives close to the earth can be. Which is to say, not forever, because nothing is forever, but for as long as it needed to be, and fully, without reservation, with every honest thing they had, which was enough, which was, in the end, everything.